Trying to force someone else to wake up is like trying to force them to change. That only has a tendency to blow up in your face, because it will trigger a backlash effect where their ego will instinctively repel any such efforts. Here's the deal. Awakening typically happens gradually over a long period of time, say years or decades. Rare are the overnight transformations like Eckhart Tolle, who claims in his book The Power of Now that he essentially had an internal crisis where he was on the verge of committing suicide before having a sudden realization that pretty much permanently shifted his state of consciousness. But even then, in that extreme circumstance, Tolle's karmic path had probably been unfolding for decades already, if not multiple lifetimes, so it likely wasn't as abrupt as it appears at first glance. And so, because spiritual growth or awakening tends to happen slowly in an incremental fashion, trying to jolt someone else awake so that they're up to your level is actually a violent act. It's akin to ripping them out of their comfort zone, which you have no right to do. One thing you'll notice as you become more awake is that you'll also start to feel more constrained. It's a bit ironic that as you gain spiritual wisdom and power, you actually lose some degree of personal freedom. This is because there are so many suboptimal or harmful paths one can take, but comparatively very few optimal or highly moral pathways. This necessarily constrains the actions of one who is truly awake and aware. It's the basis for that old expression, on the straight and narrow. The righteous path is indeed narrow or limited compared to the scope of all viable possibilities, and it is straight in that it is fairly straightforward, honest, and predictable. As a personal example, I used to date multiple women and sort of play the field, so to speak, throughout most of my 20s and early 30s. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with that, I was doing so in a manipulative way, basically leading women on and not telling them that I was seeing other girls. Even though I tried to keep things as casual as possible, for the most part, to not send the wrong signals, I knew that most of them wouldn't have gone along with it if I told them my true intentions. I then rationalized away any potential harm I was doing by telling myself stuff like, well, if she's too dumb or careless to not define the relationship or otherwise ensure that we're on the same page, that's her problem, not mine. And while I always strive to never outright lie, like saying I love you when I didn't mean it, I would nevertheless play this underhanded game where it was essentially a case of lying by omission, of leading her on in order to get what I wanted, which was usually just casual sex and companionship, not a long-term meaningful relationship. But at this stage in my life, I can no longer morally engage in such deceit. My conscience or higher self won't allow it. It feels like I can't even attract such opportunities into my life anymore because I'm no longer resonating on that level. It would be an uphill battle and a regression to go back to those ways now. And so my outlook and actions towards romantic relationships have reached a point where I feel more constrained than before, less free to engage in the sorts of promiscuous behaviors that I used to. There are many such examples of this on the spiritual path. It can range from relationships and how you treat people, to diet, or to career and finances. It encompasses all areas of life, really. Over time, however, people get settled into their little comfort zones. They establish their own routines and habits, likes and dislikes, and it is up to them to get to a point where they can willingly decide to no longer partake in anything harmful or self-destructive. But until then, that is their free choice to do so. For you or I to instead come along and say, throw out an alcoholic's bottles of booze, that is theft. That is destruction of someone else's property. That isn't fair. Even if you know it would be better for them in the long run. I remember doing something just like this as a child, where me and my sister snatched my uncle's cigarettes and threw them in the garbage, explaining that it was for his own good because cigarettes are bad for you, duh. And while we were absolutely right, from a health-based standpoint, it was still immoral because it violated his personal freedom and ability to decide for himself. This is a bit of nuance that I didn't appreciate as a kid when my parents backed him up and made us return his pack of smokes. Another great example is veganism. Eating a plant-based diet would undoubtedly be better for the average person's health and certainly for the environment, and from an ethical standpoint it's a no-brainer. But there are few things more obnoxious than a pretentious puritanical vegan. Let people come to that decision on their own. Don't pressure or try to shame them into adopting a restrictive diet when they don't want to or aren't ready for it. You're only going to hurt the cause by being overly aggressive. I guess the key takeaway here is that true spirituality isn't forceful. It isn't violent or judgmental. On the contrary, it is kind. It is patient and caring. It's about holding compassion for such people and perhaps gently steering them in a more favorable direction if that's possible. Its value can be demonstrated through leading by example. After all, if you truly are awakened and think you have it all figured out, or at least more so than your family member or friend who you're trying to convince, then that should be reflected in you for all to see. Your life should look pretty amazing and awe-inspiring, right? People should naturally want to listen to you and seek your advice because it's just so self-evident that what you're doing is working. If this isn't the case, maybe you're not quite as evolved as you think yet. I'd like to close here with an excerpt from Tom Campbell's book, My Big Toe, where he explains his comprehensive theory on reality in great detail and reaffirms this notion of non-forcefulness. Quote, "If you know anybody in a predicament like this, please be kind, empathetic, and helpful to them. They have been caught in a trap, many were born in captivity and know of nothing else, and deserve your patience and compassion. What should you do to help? Love them and let them be. They will eventually figure it out. Just love them and let them be, and evolve your consciousness to the greatest extent possible. That way, if asked, you can point out unseen opportunities and options from a more balanced and less ego-driven perspective, serve as a good example, and provide encouragement through living proof that success is possible. That is about all you can do to help." End quote. While it might sound a bit disappointing or hopeless even, this represents, in my opinion, the patient restraint of wisdom. When someone is ready to wake up, the correct lessons and teachers will appear. But until then, any well-meaning advice, evidence, and arguments will tend to fall on deaf ears.